The temperature had already dropped to 15 below zero when Thomas Winters realized his cabin was 3 miles away through snow too deep to cross before nightfall. He had one tool, one idea most mountain men would have called insane, and approximately 2 hours of daylight left to make it work. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Thomas Winters stood at the coordinates where the cache should have been and saw nothing but undisturbed snow. He had walked 4 hours through the Montana wilderness to reach this spot, a sheltered grove of spruce trees where he and Marcus Reed had agreed to meet on November 7, 1841. The plan had been simple. Marcus would bring supplies from their main camp, Thomas would bring the furs from his week-long trapline circuit. They would divide the load and return together before the weather turned. But Marcus was not here. The cache was not here, and the weather was turning fast. Thomas looked at the sky and felt his stomach tighten. The high, thin clouds that had been present at dawn had thickened into a solid gray ceiling moving in from the northwest. The temperature had dropped noticeably in the past hour. The wind, which had been calm all morning, now carried an edge that cut through his wool coat. He recognized these signs. A major storm was building, the kind that could drop temperatures to 20 below or colder and bury the landscape in fresh snow within hours. He needed to make decisions quickly. He considered his options with the methodical thinking that had kept him alive through 5 winters in the Rockies. His main cabin was 3 miles northeast, through terrain he knew well under normal conditions. But conditions were not normal. The snow depth from previous storms was already waist-deep in many places, deeper in the drifts. Breaking trail in deep snow was exhausting work. 3 miles of it, in dropping temperatures, with a storm coming, would take 4 to 5 hours. He did not have 4 to 5 hours of daylight remaining. He had perhaps 2. Thomas pulled out his pocket watch. 2:15 in the afternoon. Sunset would come around 4:30 this time of year. That meant 5 o'clock was his absolute deadline for having shelter. He looked northeast toward where his cabin stood, invisible beyond the forest and rolling terrain. 3 miles, 4 to 5 hours of brutal work, arriving long after dark in a full blizzard. The alternative was to stay here and try to survive the storm without shelter. He assessed his supplies. 1 wool coat, 1 fur hat, leather gloves, canvas trousers. Around his waist, a belt with a small knife. In his coat pocket, a fire kit and a piece of dried venison, jerky about the size of his palm. In his right hand, his walking staff, a piece of ash wood 5.5 feet long, lashed to the top with leather cord was a small hatchet with a 3-inch blade. This was not equipment for surviving a winter storm in the open. A fire would help, but maintaining it in a blizzard was nearly impossible. The wind would scatter heat. The snow would dampen wood. Thomas was not given to panic, but standing in that grove with storm clouds building overhead, he felt the sharp clarity that comes when death becomes immediate. He needed shelter within 2 hours, and he had almost nothing to build it with. Then he remembered something Jacob Peterson had told him. Jacob Peterson had been 63 years old when Thomas first met him in the fall of 1836. The old Norwegian trapper had wintered in the Rockies for nearly 20 years, longer than most men survived in the mountains. He had a face like weathered leather and pale blue eyes that seemed to see through pretense and foolishness with equal clarity. Thomas had been green that first season, 22 years old, and full of confidence that evaporated quickly when he realized how little he actually knew about surviving a mountain winter. Jacob had taken Thomas under his guidance that season, not out of sentiment, but out of practical necessity. 2 men could trap more efficiently than 1, and Jacob needed a partner whose youth could compensate for his aging joints. They had spent 4 months together in a small cabin on the Gallatin River, running trap lines and processing pelts. During the long winter evenings, Jacob had talked about his homeland and the things he had learned before coming to America. He spoke about the Sami people, reindeer herders who lived in the far north of Norway and Sweden, in places where winter was longer and colder than anything the Rocky Mountains offered. Jacob had worked among them as a young man before coming west. The Sami had taught him things about cold and snow that contradicted everything Jakob had believed. Most men feared snow and fought against it. They built walls to keep it out. They cleared it away from shelters. They saw it as the enemy. The Sami understood something different. Snow was not the enemy. Cold air was the enemy. Wind was the enemy. Snow, properly understood, was protection against both. Jakob had explained the principle on a night when temperature outside their cabin dropped to 30 below zero. He held up a wool blanket and asked Thomas why it kept a man warm. Thomas said something about thickness. Jakob shook his head. Wool kept you warm because it trapped air. The tiny fibers created thousands of small pockets where air could not move. Still, air was the best insulation that existed. Moving air stripped heat away. Still, air held heat close. Snow worked the same way, Jakob said. A snowpack was not solid. It was millions of tiny ice crystals with air trapped between them. Deep snow was like a blanket covering the earth. The ground beneath deep snow stayed warmer than the air above it because snow trapped the earth's heat and prevented wind from stealing it. The Sami had known this for centuries. When caught in extreme cold far from shelter, they did not try to build walls against wind. They dug into the snow itself. Jakob described snow caves he had seen in Norway, tunnels carved into deep drifts where men and animals could survive storms that would kill them in minutes above ground. He explained that inside a properly built snow cave, temperature would stabilize around the freezing point regardless of how cold outside air became. Body heat alone could keep the interior survivable. No fire needed. No wood to gather. Just knowledge and effort. Thomas had listened with polite skepticism. They seemed like old man tales, exaggerations grown larger with retelling. He had never tested Jakob's claims. He had never needed to. His winters had been spent in solid cabins with fireplaces and adequate supplies. The idea of deliberately burying yourself in snow seemed insane. But standing in the spruce grove with storm, clouds building, and no cabin within reach, Thomas heard Jakob's voice in his memory as clearly as if the old Norwegian stood beside him. Still, air is the best insulation. Snow traps air. Dig into it, not away from it. Thomas chose his location with care. 30 yards from the grove's center, a massive fallen spruce had created a natural snowdrift. The tree had fallen years earlier, its trunk nearly 4 feet in diameter. Snow had accumulated on the leeward side, piled deep by prevailing winds. Thomas walked around the drift, probing with his staff. The snow here was at least 6 feet deep, possibly more. The base was sheltered by the fallen log on one side and a rocky outcrop on the other. He checked his watch. 2:35. He had perhaps 90 minutes of workable light. Better to have the basic structure complete before sunset. Thomas removed his coat and draped it over a low branch. Working in a coat would make him sweat, and sweat meant death in extreme cold. He kept his wool, shirt, and canvas trousers. He pulled his fur hat down tight and flexed his fingers in their leather gloves. Then he unlashed the hatchet from his walking staff. He knelt at the base of the drift and began to dig. The surface snow was soft, recent accumulation from storms over the past week. He scooped it away with his gloved hands. Beneath the soft layer, the snow became denser, compressed by its own weight into a firm mass. This was what he needed. Soft snow would collapse. Dense snow would hold its shape. Thomas began chopping with the hatchet, cutting blocks of compressed snow and pulling them free. Each block was roughly the size of a loaf of bread. He worked horizontally into the drift, creating a tunnel entrance at ground level. The entrance needed to be small, just large enough for him to crawl through. A larger opening would allow cold air to pour in. He remembered Jakob talking about this. Too large and you lost heat. Too small and you could not enter or exit efficiently. He cut and removed snow methodically, piling the blocks to either side of the growing entrance. The work was harder than anticipated. Each swing of the hatchet jarred his arm. Each block removed required him to reach deeper into the tunnel to extract it. After 30 minutes, he had penetrated approximately 3 feet into the drift. His shoulders ached. His hands were cold despite the gloves and the exertion. He paused to check the sky. The clouds had lowered noticeably. The light was dimming earlier than expected. Thomas pulled his coat back on and allowed himself 2 minutes of rest. Then he removed the coat and returned to digging. The tunnel extended slowly, 4 feet deep, then 5. He was now working entirely by feel, reaching into darkness to cut and remove snow. He shaped the tunnel carefully, smoothing the walls with his gloved hands, creating a passage that angled slightly upward. Warm air rises. An upward angle would trap heat in the interior chamber. At 6 feet deep, Thomas began excavating the sleeping chamber. He worked the hatchet in wider arcs, hollowing out a space. The chamber did not need to be large, just big enough for him to lie down with his knees slightly bent. He removed snow until his arms could barely reach the back wall. The chamber was perhaps 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 3 feet high. Cramped, but survivable. He smoothed the ceiling carefully, rounding it to prevent ice crystals from forming points that would drip on him during the night. Full darkness had fallen by the time he finished. Thomas crawled backward out of the tunnel, exhausted. His entire body ached. His clothes were damp with sweat despite the cold, but he had done it. He had carved a shelter into solid snow using nothing but a small hatchet and 2 hours of desperate work. Thomas crawled into his snow tunnel as full darkness settled over the mountains. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. The wind drove snow horizontally through the yoss, trees. He could hear it howling above his shelter, a sound that would have terrified him if he were still exposed. Instead, he lay in a chamber carved from snow, learning whether Jacob Peterson's stories were truth or fantasy. The first thing he noticed was silence. Wind noise faded to almost nothing once he was inside the tunnel. Snow walls absorbed sound, creating acoustic deadness. The second thing was darkness. It was absolute. He could not see his hand in front of his face. The third thing was the cold. It was still cold, but different. Outside, wind had cut through his clothing. Inside, the air was still. His face began to regain feeling. Thomas pulled his jerky from his pocket and ate half, chewing slowly. He had no idea when he would eat again. Marcus might arrive tomorrow or not at all. He needed to make his tiny food supply last. The jerky was tough and salty. When he finished, he wrapped the remaining piece and returned it to his pocket. He tried to sleep but could not. His mind processed everything that had happened. The choice to check the cache alone. The choice to dig into snow instead of attempting to reach his cabin. Either choice could kill him. After what felt like an hour, Thomas realized he was warmer than when he first entered. The temperature had stabilized. He estimated it was near freezing, perhaps 30 degrees. Outside was 20 below. The snow walls were providing 50 degrees of insulation. Jacob had been right. The physics worked. But there was a problem. As his body heat warmed the chamber, he began to feel drowsy. Not comfortable drowsiness, but a heavy, sluggish feeling that made his thoughts slow. He recognized it as carbon dioxide buildup. He was breathing in a sealed chamber. His exhalations were filling the space with gas his body could not use. If he fell asleep without addressing this, he might not wake up. Thomas forced himself to move. He crawled to the tunnel entrance, which he had blocked loosely with packed snow. He pushed the snow block aside, allowing fresh air to flow in. Temperature dropped immediately as cold air poured through. He waited until his head cleared, until the drowsy feeling faded, then he partially blocked the entrance again. Not sealed, just restricted, enough airflow to stay alive. Not so much that all heat escaped. He returned to his sleeping position and lay still, monitoring how he felt. The drowsiness did not return. Temperature stabilized again, colder than before but still far warmer than outside. He had found the balance, enough ventilation to breathe, enough insulation to survive. Thomas did not sleep much that first night. Every hour he would crawl to the entrance to check conditions and adjust the snow block. Each time he felt the brutal cold outside and the relative warmth inside. Each time, he understood more clearly that this tunnel was the only reason he was still alive. The storm raged through the night, wind howled, snow fell heavily, temperature continued, dropping. But inside his carved chamber, Thomas survived. When gray light finally began to filter through the entrance tunnel, he was exhausted, hungry, and cold, but alive. Night 1 was finished. Dawn on day 2 brought no relief. Thomas crawled to the tunnel entrance and looked out at a world transformed. The storm had intensified overnight. Snow fell so heavily he could barely see the trees 30 feet away. Wind created drifts that had already begun to cover his tunnel entrance. Temperature felt even colder than the previous night, though he had no way to measure it precisely. He retreated back inside and considered his situation carefully. He had survived one night, which proved the tunnel concept worked. But one night was not 12 nights. He needed to improve the structure while he still had strength. Starvation would weaken him progressively. What he could accomplish today, he might not be able to accomplish in 3 days or 5 days. He needed to work now. Thomas spent the morning enlarging the sleeping chamber. The initial excavation had been rushed, just barely large enough. Now he expanded it methodically, removing snow from the walls and ceiling to create more space. Not too much space, which would be harder to heat, but enough that he could sit up without hitting his head and turn over without touching both walls. He carved a small alcove in one wall where he could store his hat and gloves when not wearing them. He smoothed every surface carefully, eliminating rough spots that might shed ice crystals. The removed snow he packed into the tunnel entrance, narrowing it further. A smaller entrance meant less heat loss. He left just enough room to crawl through on hands and knees. He shaped the entrance carefully, creating a slight downward angle from the sleeping chamber to the outside. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. The angle would help trap warmth in the sleeping area. By midday, Thomas addressed the ventilation problem that had nearly killed him the first night. He took his walking staff and pushed it upward through the ceiling of the sleeping chamber, twisting and working it until it penetrated to the surface. When he pulled the staff back down, he had created a narrow vertical shaft, approximately 2 inches in diameter. He could feel fresh air flowing down through the shaft. The hole was small enough that heat loss was minimal but large enough to provide adequate air exchange. He would not need to adjust the entrance block constantly anymore. In the afternoon, he created a small side chamber off the main sleeping area. This chamber was tiny, just large enough to hold a pile of snow. He understood that he would need drinking water, and melting snow against his body inside his coat was more efficient than trying to eat snow directly, which would lower his core temperature. The side chamber gave him a supply of clean snow within easy reach. Thomas also carved a small shelf into one wall where he placed his fire kit. Keeping it off the floor meant it would stay drier. He positioned his knife within easy reach. He arranged everything methodically, creating systems that would help him survive the days ahead. By late afternoon, he was exhausted. He had eaten nothing. His body was consuming itself for energy. But the tunnel was no longer just a desperate hole in the snow. It was a functional shelter, engineered for survival. Night 6 began like the previous 5. Thomas crawled into his tunnel as darkness fell and temperature plummeted. He had survived 5 nights. He had refined his shelter until it functioned with remarkable efficiency. He understood the physics of snow insulation. He knew how to manage ventilation and heat retention. But on night 6, none of that mattered. The psychological weight of isolation finally broke through his methodical defenses. He lay in absolute darkness and felt despair settle over him like a physical thing. The hunger was constant now, a gnawing emptiness that never left. His body had consumed the small piece of jerky days ago. Since then, he had eaten nothing. His strength was fading. He could feel it in how long simple tasks took, in how his hands trembled when he worked. But worse than hunger was the loneliness. 6 days without seeing another human face. 6 days of nothing but wind, sound, and darkness, and the walls of his snow prison. He started to question everything. Why had Marcus not come? Was Marcus dead? Had something happened at the main camp? Did anyone know where Thomas was? Would anyone come looking? Thomas thought about his sister Catherine back in Pennsylvania. She had begged him not to return to the mountains after their parents died. She said the mountains would kill him eventually, that every trapper's luck ran out. He had dismissed her concerns. He was careful. He was skilled. He knew what he was doing. Now, lying in a hole in the snow, slowly starving to death, he wondered if she had been right. The tunnel that had saved his life began to feel like a tomb he had built for himself. The darkness was suffocating. The silence was maddening. He had survived the physical challenge of extreme cold, but the mental challenge was different, harder, more insidious. He could engineer solutions to physical problems. He could not engineer his way out of despair. Thomas considered abandoning the shelter. The storm had ended 2 days earlier. The weather was clear, cold but clear. His cabin was 3 miles away. 3 miles through deep snow in his weakened condition would probably kill him, but probably was not, certainly. Maybe he could make it. Maybe dying while trying to reach safety was better than dying here in the dark. He lay there for hours, arguing with himself. Part of his mind insisted that leaving was suicide. The tunnel had kept him alive. His body could survive longer without food. Marcus might still come. Part of his mind insisted that staying was equally suicidal. Each day without food made him weaker. Eventually, he would be too weak to walk at all. If he was going to attempt the journey, he needed to do it before complete weakness made it impossible. Dawn came slowly. Gray light filtered through his entrance tunnel. Thomas had not slept. He had spent the entire night battling himself. When morning finally arrived, he made his decision. He would stay one more day. Just one more. If Marcus did not come by sunset on day 7, Thomas would attempt to reach his cabin regardless of the odds. He crawled outside into morning light, exhausted by a night that had tested him in ways no amount of cold ever could. Day 7 brought weather that made the previous week seem mild by comparison. Thomas woke to silence so profound it felt unnatural. He crawled to the entrance and understood immediately. The air outside was colder than anything he had experienced. When he exhaled, his breath froze instantly, creating ice crystals that fell like tiny diamonds. He guessed the temperature had dropped to 30, below zero, possibly colder. He retreated into the tunnel and felt the difference immediately. Even inside his shelter, the cold was more aggressive. His breath created visible fog. The walls, which had remained stable for days, now showed a thin layer of frost. The temperature inside had dropped to perhaps 20 degrees. Still warmer than outside, but cold enough that his body struggled to maintain core warmth. Thomas understood what was happening. His body had been without food for 6 full days. Whatever reserves he had possessed were gone. His metabolism was slowing. His ability to generate heat was diminishing. The tunnel could only do so much. It could prevent wind from stripping heat away. It could provide insulation, but it could not create warmth. Only his body could do that, and his body was failing. He spent day 7 trying to stay warm through movement. He would exercise in the cramped sleeping chamber, doing small movements with his arms and legs until his muscles generated warmth. Then he would lie still immediately, trying to trap that warmth inside his clothing. The technique worked briefly. His core temperature would rise slightly. But within minutes, the cold would seep back in. He would need to exercise again. The cycle was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. By night 7, Thomas faced a new crisis. His hands and feet were going numb in a way that frightened him. Not the temporary numbness of cold exposure that would reverse with warming. This was deeper, more permanent. He recognized the early stages of frostbite. He tucked his hands inside his coat against his chest. He drew his knees up and tucked his feet against his body. The positions were uncomfortable, but necessary. Night 8 was worse. Temperature outside dropped further. Thomas guessed it reached 35 below zero. Inside the tunnel, he could no longer maintain enough body heat to stay comfortable. He shivered constantly. The shivering was involuntary. His body's attempt to generate warmth through muscle movement. It worked, but it also consumed energy he did not have. He began to understand that his timeline was shorter than he had thought. Not days, hours. Maybe one more night, maybe two. His body was shutting down. The cold was winning despite his shelter, despite his knowledge, despite everything he had done correctly. Night 9 brought a strange calm. Thomas stopped shivering. He knew this was a bad sign. When the body stopped shivering, it meant core temperature was dropping dangerously low. It meant the end was close. He lay in darkness and thought about Catherine. He thought about Jakob. He thought about all the things he had learned about snow and survival. Knowledge that would die with him because no one would ever know where he was or what he had discovered. He closed his eyes and waited for morning, uncertain if morning would come. Thomas woke on day 10 to something he had not heard in over a week. Silence, not the muffled. Silence of the tunnel, but true silence. The wind had stopped. He crawled to the entrance with difficulty. His body responded slowly, muscles weak and uncoordinated. He pushed aside the snow block and emerged into blinding sunlight. The world outside was transformed. Fresh snow covered everything in pristine white. The sky was clear, brilliant blue, stretching to every horizon. The storm had finally broken. Temperature was still brutally cold, probably 20 below, but without wind, the cold felt less vicious. More importantly, visibility was perfect. He could see for miles. Thomas stood on shaking legs and looked northeast toward where his cabin lay. 3 miles through deep snow. In his current condition, the journey would take 4 or 5 hours, maybe longer. He assessed himself honestly. He was weak, he was starving, his coordination was impaired. But he was alive, and the weather had given him an opportunity. He also knew that attempting the journey today might be the mistake that killed him. If he started walking and his strength gave out halfway, he would die in the open. If weather turned while he was exposed, he would have no shelter. If he fell and injured himself, he would freeze before he could recover. Thomas made a decision that went against every instinct, screaming at him to leave immediately. He would spend today improving his tunnel for long-term survival. He would rest. He would conserve his remaining strength. Tomorrow, if weather held and if his body could endure one more night, he would attempt the journey. But not today. The decision felt wrong even as he made it. Every moment in the tunnel was another moment without food, another moment of his body consuming itself. But panic had killed more mountain men than patience ever had. He needed to think clearly. He needed to plan carefully. Thomas spent the daylight hours in sunshine for the first time since the ordeal began. He enlarged the tunnel entrance to make exit and entry easier. He reinforced the sleeping chamber walls. He created a second ventilation shaft to improve air circulation. He worked slowly, resting frequently, but he worked. The physical activity helped him mentally. It gave him purpose beyond simply waiting to die. He also prepared for tomorrow's journey. He tested his walking staff, making sure it was sound. He checked his knife. He organized his minimal supplies. He planned the route he would take, visualizing landmarks he would need to find. The creek bed would be his guide. If he followed it northeast, he would eventually reach the area where his cabin stood. As sunset approached, Thomas took one last look at the world outside before crawling back into his tunnel. The sky remained clear. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night fell. He sealed himself inside and lay down in darkness. This was night 10. 2 more nights would make 12. He wondered if he would survive to see 12. He wondered if tomorrow's walk would be his salvation or his death. He closed his eyes and tried to rest, knowing that tomorrow would decide everything. Thomas did not attempt the walk on day 11. He woke that morning too weak to stand. The decision had been made for him. His body had reached its limit. He spent day 11 lying in his tunnel, drifting between consciousness and something that was not quite sleep. He knew he was dying. The knowledge was strangely peaceful. Day 12 brought unexpected clarity. His mind felt sharp even as his body failed. He lay in darkness and reviewed everything that had happened. 12 nights in a snow tunnel. 12 nights surviving on nothing but knowledge and determination. He thought about Jakob Peterson and the stories that had saved his life. He thought about the Sami herders who had understood Snow's properties centuries before American trappers arrived in these mountains. Thomas understood something important as he lay there. What he had learned was not just personal survival technique, it was knowledge that could save other men's lives. Trappers died in winter storms every year because they did not understand that snow could be shelter. They died trying to fight their way through blizzards. They died building inadequate shelters above ground. They died because they feared snow instead of understanding it. If Thomas survived, he would share this knowledge with every trapper he met. He would explain the physics. He would describe the construction technique. He would make sure that his suffering had purpose beyond keeping himself alive. Knowledge shared was knowledge that endured. He thought about Marcus Reed. If Marcus had died in the same storm, then no one knew where Thomas was. No one would come looking. Thomas would die here, and the tunnel would eventually collapse under its own weight, erasing all evidence of what he had accomplished. The thought saddened him more than his own approaching death. Not for himself, but for the men who would die in future winters, because they never learned what Thomas had discovered. As darkness fell on night 12, Thomas made peace with his situation. He had done everything possible. He had used every bit of knowledge and skill he possessed. If it was not enough, then it was not enough. He had no regrets about his choices. The tunnel had given him 12 nights he would not have survived otherwise. 12 nights was better than 1 night exposed to the storm. 12 nights was better than dying while trying to walk 3 miles through deep snow. He had chosen correctly. He lay still and listened to his own breathing. It was shallow, weak. He wondered how many more breaths he had. Hundreds? Dozens? He did not know. He thought about Catherine one last time. She would never know what happened to him. She would spend years wondering if he was alive somewhere in the mountains. That knowledge hurt more than the cold, more than the hunger, more than anything else. Thomas closed his eyes as night 12 deepened around. Him. He did not expect to see morning. He had survived 12 nights in a snow tunnel with nothing but a hatchet and knowledge. If this was where his story ended, it had been a good fight. He had proven that Jacob's stories were true. He had proven that understanding nature was more powerful than fighting it. Thomas woke on day 13 and was surprised to be alive. Gray light filtered through his tunnel entrance. He lay still for several minutes, assessing his body. He was weak. He was starving. But he was conscious. Something during the night had changed. Perhaps his body had found some final reserve. Perhaps his will to survive had pushed him past the point where he should have died. He did not understand it, but he accepted it. He crawled to the entrance with immense effort. Outside, the weather remained clear. Temperature was still brutally cold, but the sky was blue. This was his chance, possibly his last chance. If he did not walk today, he would not walk at all. Thomas took one long look at the snow tunnel that had saved his life. The entrance he had carved 12 days ago, the walls he had shaped and refined, the ventilation shaft he had punched through to the surface. It was just a hole in the snow. But it was the most important thing he had ever built. He turned northeast and began walking. The first 100 yards nearly killed him. His legs barely functioned. His balance was gone. He fell twice in the first few minutes. Each time, he forced himself back up. Each time, he took another step, then another. He followed the creek bed northeast. The landmarks were familiar even under heavy snow. That bent tree, that rock outcrop, that open meadow. He knew this terrain. He had walked it dozens of times, but never like this. Never this weak. Never this close to death. The walk took 6 hours. 6 hours of forcing his body forward when every cell screamed to stop. 6 hours of falling and rising and falling again. 6 hours of will overcoming physical limitation. He did not remember most of it. His mind retreated somewhere deep, leaving only the basic drive to move forward. He saw his cabin as afternoon light began to fade. The small log structure looked like paradise. He reached the door and fell against it. His hands would not work properly. It took several minutes to lift the latch. He crawled inside and collapsed. Marcus Reed found him 2 days later. Marcus had been delayed by the same storm, trapped at the main camp. When he finally reached Thomas's cabin and found Thomas barely alive, Marcus listened to the story of 12 nights in a snow tunnel with obvious disbelief. But when Thomas took him to see the structure, still intact in the snowpack, Marcus understood. Word spread through the trapping community. The following winter, when young Billy Crenshaw got caught in similar conditions 50 miles away, he remembered Thomas's story. Billy dug his own snow tunnel and survived 4 nights before rescue. By 1843, snow tunnel technique had become accepted knowledge among northern trappers. Thomas Winters never sought recognition. He simply shared what desperation had taught him. The snow tunnel that saved his life became a legacy that saved dozens more. Understanding nature's physics could transform a killer into shelter. Survival meant working with wilderness, not against it. That knowledge, born of 12 impossible nights, endured long after Thomas himself was gone.